All right, so those are probably not the two words that you would want to see on a screen in the sanctuary of a church. And I was trying to find something more imaginative, but I just couldn't think of anything better. I thought of some things that they were even more inappropriate, so we'll just move on with this. And we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount. Last week we talked about Jesus talking about murder and anger. We're getting into the heart message of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is using heart language rather than law language. He's comparing law language to heart language. The Pharisees loved the law language. I'll tell you, as a stoic, logical, OCD lawyer, I pretty much prefer law language too. I like to know this is what the rule is, this is what breaking the rule looks like, and this is what the punishment is if I break the rule. I like that. I like that clarity. Jesus is making it all a little bit more fuzzy, making it all a little bit more poetic, making it all those things that don't work in my side of the brain that dominates. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning. And so we are going to look, diving right in. Allison, I'm sorry, I'm not. Okay, there we go. Okay, we're looking at Matthew 5. Actually, it's 27 and 28. In fact, I'm going to read the passage, 27 through 30, and I just have 28 up on the screen for space sake. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to desire her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better to lose one of your members than to have your whole body thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better to lose one of your members than to have your whole body go into hell. Harsh words, again, if you read them legally, you get into all sorts of weird things where people are going to start plucking out their literal physical eyes. And I don't think that's what Jesus is necessarily saying here. But I want to look at focusing on verse 28. I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to desire her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I have deliberately used the Net Bible, the New English Translation here, because I think that its translation right there is probably the more effective one, the more faithful one to the original Greek. And that's what we're going to be focusing on this morning. Nearly every other English translation I've looked, I found only one other translation that uses the word desire there. And nearly every other English translation uses lust, lustfully, to lust after. It's a verb in the Greek, to lust. And when you think about it, I can see where there might be a temptation to think that by using the word desire here, the New English Translation Committee sort of softened the language. Lust is a stronger word, right? But I don't think that that was their intent, was to soften language. I think their intent was to get back to the spirit of what Jesus was actually saying, because Jesus was saying more than whoever looks at a woman lustfully. Because the Greek word for desire there is deeper and broader and more inclusive than just looking lustfully. So it's not that desire, the word desire softens the language of lustful, but it expands it. Because where I'm heading this morning with this lesson, as you'll see, I believe that there are more ways of having inappropriate, adulterous desire than merely in the realm of sexuality. You can have emotional desire that's inappropriately expressed. You can have romantic desire that's inappropriately expressed. You can even have spiritual desire that's inappropriately expressed. And we'll go into more detail on each one of those. When we think of the word lust, we typically think of strong sexual desire. In fact, that is the dictionary definition of the English word lust. Strong sexual desire. And that definition, that physical desire, is included in the Greek word that Jesus is using here. But the Greek word that Jesus is using goes beyond that. When we think of somebody looking lustfully at a woman, and because this language is gender specific, we typically think of a young man, teens, early 20s, looking at things he shouldn't be looking at a woman with desire that he shouldn't have. And that's pretty much as far as it goes. We don't necessarily think of women looking lustfully, in part because Jesus doesn't word it that way, but also in part because we believe we have heard over and over again, and we'll get to it later on, that women generally aren't as visually oriented as men. And we'll talk about that. There's a lot to talk about here and unpack. But as we go through this, what I want us to see is how this Greek word goes beyond mere physical sexual desire. So these are the points I want to make this morning. And I know there's a lot here. First, that biblical lust means to desire. The word that's translated as lust means to desire. And that desire includes a whole bunch of desires, both positive and negative. We'll see that in a second. Biblical lust is not only physical in nature. It is not limited to men. And probably the biggest thing I want to get at is biblical lust is forgivable. If there's anything that comes close to being an unpardonable sin in modern day Christianity, it is the sin of sexual lust. So with this, let's look at, let me also share something. It has been often said that the job of a preacher or Bible teacher is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And yeah, and so there's going to be both of that today. I suspect that by the time I get done, most of you are going to be mad at me for something that I say up here. Okay?
No, some of us will be comforted.
Yes. But then I'm going to turn right around. Let me say this, as a matter of comfort to those who wrestle with what you believe to be lust. Biblical lust is more than simply the appreciation of beauty. Okay? It is not lustful to notice that somebody is attractive. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. Biblical lust goes beyond that, and he's looking at not only is this person attractive, but I want that person. I want that person. More so than I want my wife. Allison?
It almost makes me think of coveting.
Coveting, yes, thank you. I'm glad you said that. We'll get to John Wycliffe here in a second.
In some cases, consumed with the desire of pleasure.
Consumed with, yes. Consumed with, coveting. We'll get there. As a matter of affliction, as I said before, biblical lust is not limited to sexual desire. It can include emotional, romantic, spiritual desires, which can be inappropriately directed. What Jesus is talking about here is having a desire that is inappropriately directed. It's directed at the wrong person. And I've got a bunch of examples here as we go along. So let's dive into Bible translation and church history. This is fun. At least for me, it's fun. I hope it'll be fun for you. It'll be eye-opening. The Greek word here that Jesus uses is epithumeo. And I know I'm probably not pronouncing it right. Bear with me. Epithumeo. It's a verb form. There's a noun form of the word as well, but here it's a verb form. What's interesting is that this word epithumeo is very generic. It simply means to desire. It is used 16 times in the New Testament, and in 10 of those instances, it is used in a positive sense. Think of where Jesus is eating the Passover with the disciples on the Last Supper. And he says unto them, with desire I have desired to eat this meal with you. You could translate that as, with lust I have lusted to eat this meal with you. Nobody would translate it that way because that's not what lust means in the English. But it's the exact same Greek word. 10 of the 16 times it is used like that, for a very positive desire for something good. The other 6 times it's used in a negative sense, as we see here in Matthew. And so what we have here is a very innocuous Greek word that doesn't necessarily limit itself to sexual lust. So how do we get from 1st century innocuous Greek to 21st century lust, which is probably what all of your Bibles say? And here we have to go back to 2 guys. I've talked about these guys in the past. Now have some fun with church history now. St. Jerome and St. Augustine. These 2 men together probably have had the greatest influence on Western Christianity than any people. You could say that about St. Augustine by himself. Okay, let's check the Amber Alerts.
Warren Roberts.
Okay. St. Augustine is called the father of Western Christianity. He has had more influence on the way you and I think as Christians, even today, in evangelical America, than any other human being in history. And I'm saying even including the Apostle Paul. I believe St. Augustine has had that much influence. St. Jerome, while not having that much, his influence was a little bit more subtle. His influence came in the fact that he translated the Latin Vulgate Bible. And for 1100 years, from about 400 AD until the 1500s and the Protestant Reformation, the Latin Vulgate was the Bible. Nobody cared about Greek manuscripts in those 1100 years. And even in the Catholic Church today, the Latin Vulgate is their standard of the Bible. And so the way he translated the Bible had a tremendous impact on the way Christians for the last 1600 years, including you and me, have read the Bible. So these guys are really, really important. These 2 guys also had 2 qualities about them that are unfortunate and embarrassing, and this is where my red shirt will come in handy. Neither of these guys ever got married. Both of these guys, at least in their early years, were very sexually active. So imagine this, if you will. 2 guys, very active sex lives. They never once in their lives experienced sex the way God intended it to be experienced. The emotions that they felt and associated with their sexuality were emotions of fear, shame, and guilt. That's all they ever knew. They did not understand married sex. At least they never experienced it. And I believe that fact for both of these guys influenced how they viewed marriage, how they viewed human sexuality, and how they viewed Jesus' words in Matthew 5. Let me just click the next part. In 400 or so AD, Jerome translated the Latin Vulgate. It actually took him about 20 years to get it done. And he wasn't the only one involved. When he translated the Latin Vulgate, for this word epithumeo, he used the Latin word concupiscendum. Now, concupiscendum, if you've ever heard the word concupiscence, I mean, if you have a King James Bible, it's in there. It refers to a sinful desire. Not a desire in general, but now it's a sinful desire. And St. Augustine took it one step further. St. Augustine wrote a treatise entitled On Marriage and Concupiscence. That was the title of it, On Marriage and Concupiscence. He was trying to share with us all how we should live our lives as godly Christians. And Augustine developed an attitude towards marriage and physical relations in marriage that ended up becoming the standard of the church even up until today, 2023. Augustine could not in his mind reconcile the fact that God commands us to be fruitful and multiply with the fact that the act required to obey that command requires the loss of self-control, at least on the part of the male. A male cannot do his part in making a baby without losing control of his body. And Augustine could not accept that. That was just unfathomable to him. And so he developed a theology in which he decided, or he determined, that physical pleasure and physical desire were not part of God's original creation. God didn't create human reproduction that way. He stated that if Adam and Eve had wanted to make a baby before the fall, they would have done the same act that you and I do when we make babies. But the act would not have been accompanied by any physical pleasure or any physical desire. And throughout this discussion, he is using the word concupiscence to refer to physical pleasure and physical desire. He believed that concupiscence, the presence of pleasure and desire, came as a result of the fall. As a result of the fall. So that when Adam and Eve saw each other in the buff after eating the forbidden fruit, for the first time they saw each other with sexual desire, and that's why they were ashamed. They were ashamed of the desires that they were feeling by looking at each other, even though they're husband and wife. And this is where Augustine's mind is. And that's why they tried to cover up. They tried to cover up to hide their sexual attractiveness. He went further and said that because of this, now, since the fall, every act of human reproduction involves some level of sinfulness because of the inherent desire and pleasure that's associated with it. Every act of human reproduction is to some degree sinful, although he is quick to point out that it's a minor sin, not a mortal sin, just a minor sin. Yes, thank you, Augustine.
Sorry.
From there, he went on to state that the only legitimate purpose of sex within marriage is to make babies. The only, if there's any intent to seek pleasure, even within marriage, that is evil concupiscence. Now, I say all this not to poke at St. Augustine. I say all this because this is the doctrine that was adopted by the church. And at this point in time, I'm not distinguishing between Catholic and Protestant because there are no Protestants. The Christian church, this is what was known within the Christian church as the ideal in marriage. He went so far as to say, let me back up. He got some of his ideas actually from the Apostle Paul. If you read 1 Corinthians 7, which every single young Christian man has worn out in his Bible, trying to figure out, do I get married or not? Mine was totally tattered. And you see Paul saying, it's good not to get married. If you get married, you do well. But if you don't get married, you do better. Now, I'm going to be very fast to point out that even Paul, when he says this, is saying, these are not the words of the Lord, these are my words. This is my advice. This is not God's command. And I'm so grateful he said that. Because it's that passage in 1 Corinthians 7 that the Catholic Church relies upon largely for the celibacy of their priests. Okay? It's better to remain unmarried. You're not distracted from your work for the Lord. That's what Paul is saying there. And Augustine picked up on that. He fully agreed with Paul, but he went one step further. He said, even if you do get married, it's even better to remain chaste within your marriage. Sexually chaste. Okay? And so he went even that much further. So, Augustine and the church for the next 1,000 years, next 1,600 years, had the view that the only appropriate purpose for marital relations is to make babies. Later on, the Catholic Church added to that, and I'm sorry, I cannot find where they did this or when they did it. They added to it the notion that another legitimate function of human sexuality is to express marital unity. So they did say that. But even up to today, they still take a very dim view of sexual desire and pleasure even within marriage. In fact, the current Catholic Catechism has a definition of lust in it, and it includes these words. It includes inordinate enjoyment of sexual pleasure. So you're allowed to enjoy it as long as you don't enjoy it too much. Yeah, Pastor?
Catholic theologians and ethicists will typically say marriage has two functions, a procreative function and a unitive function. But we really only see Catholic theologians make that distinction in the 20th century, primarily with Pope John Paul II.
Yes.
So that's a fairly recent.
Very recent. Yeah, I knew it was recent, I just didn't know how recent.
He released an encyclical on this. And,
yes.
This language of sex as a unitive function in marriage, that's a pretty 20th century Catholic innovation.
Yes. And not only that, you know, we often talk about Catholics and their and the prohibition against birth control, and obviously that is in part to preserve life, but it's also intended to prevent encouraging too much sex for pleasure. They're trying to prevent that. And I would also point out until 1930, all Christian denominations prohibited artificial birth control. In 1930, the Anglicans were the first to relax that. And since then, other Protestants have gone along. Yeah, Matt?
It's very much sounds like it's just a bunch of Christian Pharisees. They're very legalistic about what this language is, and this, I don't think this is Jesus' intent in speaking about this, so much to say, you can do this so far, but this is what's right, and then it becomes wrong, and really, again, it has more to do with the heart language, like what you spoke about.
You're right. This is Christian Phariseeism, but because this affects the way the Bible was translated, and because we're reading the Bible in English, it affects the way we think. I mean, I can remember my 13-year-old self feeling things I've never felt before, and immediately feeling shame and guilt for feeling them. I became a Christian when I was 18 years old. I was a freshman at the University of Akron. University of Akron in the early 70s had a student body of 24,000 students. So you figure 12 or 13,000 of them are good-looking girls. I'm a brand new baby Christian walking around on that campus in the early 70s. Attending young men's discipleship Bible studies where every other week we were talking about lusting with our eyes. I spent my entire career at Akron U feeling shameful and guilty for nothing more than just simply noticing that there were attractive girls on campus. And this is where I'm trying to provide some comfort. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. I can say with absolute honesty, the way Jesus is using the word lust here, I never lusted at any of those girls. I never had any desire for any of them. But I did notice that they were there and they were pretty. Yeah, Buff?
I think all this goes back to your presupposition of God's intent when he created sex and commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. That assumes that he didn't intend that it would be pleasurable. I don't agree with him. I think he wanted it to be pleasurable, otherwise we wouldn't have nearly as many people in the world. But I think this discussion is really about control of a very natural. Yes, there have been bad presentations of it. We got the Victorian area, we got all kinds of perversions of what God really meant when he gave sex. I think he meant it to be desirable, and I think men and women have been created with a desire to seek an appropriate mate. They would strengthen the human race, and it's normal for men to check women out, women to check men out. But like the desire for food, if he gave us a desire to eat good food. If we don't control that desire, we can have a negative kickback on us. If we don't control the sexual desire, it can have a huge negative kickback. But it's really all about the need that we have to recognize the control over legitimate things. There's other things besides sex where the same principles certainly apply.
Yes. Todd.
I grew up down the street from Harmony, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And that's named after the Harmonies, who were one of the many sects, SECTS,
Okay.
that believed that Christians should not marry, should not have children.
Right.
And I think a lot of this ties into the belief that it was end times.
Yes.
So there was no reason to reproduce.
Yes.
And
you certainly see
the New Testament.
Yeah.
It's real easy to believe that the Lord was coming back any time, so it's pointless to have children.
Right.
Same with the Shakers.
Yeah, the Shakers had the same problem.
There's a whole
And-
list of them.
yeah, and that's why there are no more Shakers.
I was gonna say, they're a small movement now for a reason.
Yes, there are no more Shakers.
But all those alternatives are easier than control.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
That's the problem.
Yes.
It is hard to control a desire for what is pleasurable.
Yes, yeah, Joy.
Well, and Virgil, your comment about the 13-year-old Virgil, where, I don't know, I feel like maybe I agree with the Catholics just a little, 13-year-old Virgil feel such guilt? This whole subject is messy.
Yes, it is messy. It's terribly messy. But as I've now reached an age which is far beyond 13, I look back and I realize I wasn't alone. Allison.
I think there's a lot of Christian rhetoric that goes around that's shameful talking about sex.
Yeah.
It's very taboo. It's so, I mean, anytime, like even right now, we are all adults. Most of it, I think almost everyone, except for like maybe one or two of us, are married. And we feel icky talking about it. But this is a natural function that God created us for, to be fruitful and multiply. But we still have this like, ooh, this feels weird. We don't
Yes.
really need to talk about this. And so there's this taboo. And I think with all of this rhetoric and taboo, we don't talk about it. And so when a young child is like, oh, I'm feeling this way, but I can tell that this is taboo, people are uncomfortable talking to me about this, of course they're going to feel icky because they don't know, like, is this okay? Am I allowed to feel this way? Is this wrong?
Right.
And so people grow up really confused, and I think that's a lot of where we get into issues with any kind of sexuality, and kids are confused, and we're just not talking about it, and I think that's a big problem in
Yes.
today's Christianity.
Yes. Yes, Susan.
I know, I think I agree with what everybody's been saying, have the same thing, this feeling of I am so dirty for even having these desires, these longings, these whatever they are, and didn't feel like I had anybody to talk to, so then you turn to the world, because they
Of
have
course.
information, and that information is like trash. That didn't help. It's been interesting, I'm not saying that we're doing it right, but to teach the children, like, when this comes up, first of all, bless yourself. Like, I bless these desires that God has put within me. I'm blessing it. That's like start one. And to really commune with the Lord, like, thank you for the way you made me. Thank you for these intimate desires and longings. Starting to turn into you, and then looking forward. You know, we're talking about what do we do? How do we manage this?
Mm-hmm.
But a positive, like, yay!
Yes.
Yay! I never got a yay.
Never got a yay. You'll
Yeah.
never get that yay.
Yeah.
Okay, let me move on because I'm going to fall behind here, and we're going to get done today.
There's part two.
There's not going to be a part two because, as Allison says, this is icky. Okay, John Wycliffe.
Kind of
Ish.
useful, actually.
Yes. John Wycliffe.
Literally, yeah.
John Wycliffe gives us the first English translation of the Bible. He does not translate from the Greek, he translates from the Latin. And this is why this is important. Even though our modern translations say we're translating from the Greek, the way translators work is they rely upon earlier English translations, which rely upon earlier English translations. And all English translations go back to John Wycliffe. And John Wycliffe goes to the Latin Vulgate. He translated this Greek word epithumeo as covet. He didn't know how to spell it, but he translated it as covet. And so now we're getting into this sort of negative connotation. William Tyndale was the next guy who came along. He did use the Greek as his source material, and he gave us lusting. Again, interesting spelling, but Tyndale in 1535. Now keep in mind, by 1535, Tyndale is part of the Roman Catholic Church, okay? And at least he's grown up in the Roman Catholic Church. And now he is part of a 1,000-year Augustinian tradition of denouncing sexual pleasure and desire. So for him to use the word lusting makes perfect sense. Okay, as I said before, this is from Ellicott's commentary. When Jesus uses this word desire, he's not saying if you see an attractive person, that is lust. This is why Ellicott put it. The intent is more strongly marked in the Greek than in the English. It is not the passing glance, not even the momentary impulse of desire, but the continued gaze by which the impulse is deliberately cherished till it becomes a passion. That's what Jesus is talking about there. Now, I provide that to give us all some comfort, okay? Having said that, the passing glance can very easily become the continued gaze. And I would also point out, and forgive me if I sound sexist here, guys, our wives notice when we have even a passing glance and it's hurtful to them. Okay? They notice and it's hurtful. Okay? There was a survey done. I've looked at a lot of surveys. Survey done where these guys went up to a bunch of men and said, what do you consider to be unfaithful behavior? At what point in time is your wife or other significant other cheating on you? And the men said, well, they're cheating when they have sex with another person. That's cheating. They went up to the wives and said, when is your husband cheating on you? When he looks at another woman. There is a difference of perception here. And it's an understandable one. And maybe it's understandable because of our history. But guys, protect yourselves even from the momentary glance. Okay? When I go to the mall with my wife and she drags me by Victoria's Secret, I don't look at the double-sized, life-size posters of women in their underwear. I always try to position myself in such a way that as I'm walking by, I can look at Carol instead of looking at the store. It gets harder when she drags me into Victoria's Secret. Okay, moving on.
Carol might kill you for that one.
We're not the ones that are going to be mad at you.
I have 3 daughters and they like Victoria's Secret stuff, so. Okay, the biblical desire is more than physical. It can be sexual, it can be emotional, romantic, and spiritual. There is a concept in marriage counseling world known as the emotional affair, where 2 people grow close to each other, they bond together, they get an emotional attachment to each other. There's never anything sexual about it. Never even touch each other. And yet that, in my view, I think this is what Jesus is referring to, I think that can be an inappropriate, adulterous desire. Where you get to the point where you would rather be married to this other person than married to your own spouse. And they can be devastating. Devastating. Carol and I know a couple up in Ohio where it's a married couple. I won't tell you which one was doing what, but one of them was hooked on pornography and the other one had an emotional affair with another person. Both of those circumstances, both of those behaviors, I think fall within what Jesus is talking about here in this heart language about desiring another person. Okay, yes, Jesus uses the word woman there, but again, everything the Bible said in the first century was directed at men. Okay? And so, I think that the principles apply to women as well. It can be a romantic desire. Yeah, Allison.
I just wanted to highlight what you were saying because there's a lady that I appreciate a lot of her work because she does a lot of data collection, like even within Christian circles. Her name's Sheila Gregoire, and she actually has done a lot of surveys, and yes, it is directed towards men in the Bible, that kind of stuff, but women very much do struggle with visual and things that it's like, oh, only men, and unfortunately it's seen as shameful for a woman to do that because of how it's framed.
Somehow it goes on your orientation, like it tags on something, and that is so.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to highlight, yes. There's been data, and I mean, if anyone.
Yeah, I got more. I've got even more data on my next slide. So hang on.
Yeah, all the data.
Hang on. There can be inappropriate spiritual desire, and this is something that pastors have to guard against. And Pastor, forgive me if I jump into your world here. Pastors always have to make a decision. How am I going to deal with counseling women? And we had two pastors up in Ohio. One of them said that he would never counsel a woman unless his wife was present. This isn't so much to prevent the pastor from lusting after the woman, but to prevent the woman from falling in love with the pastor who's giving her sound spiritual guidance. Had another pastor up in Ohio. If I said his name, I mean, he was very prominent in the Alliance. If I said his name, you'd know who he is. He came to the pulpit one Sunday morning and he said, I ain't doing it, ever, again. Ladies, if you need counsel, your husband is your first counselor according to the Bible, and there are other resources. But as a pastor of a large church, he just said he wouldn't do it. And that this is a common issue. Yeah, Allison?
I was just saying, as a counselor, I mean, we are trained, I mean, your client's falling in love with you is a legitimate thing.
Yes.
Because you are there and you are impartial and you are hearing them, and you may be the first person they ever have who is like that. And so you have to actually be trained to deal with that.
Yes.
Pastors, when they enter into counseling, I'm not saying pastors can't counsel, but I don't see pastors being trained to deal with that.
No.
And so I think that causes a lot of issues on that front.
Yes, yeah. No, and you're right, I mean, it is this. Okay, yeah.
Bonnie and I, this isn't a theoretical conversation. We were part of a church where we watched that happen.
Oh, yeah.
And there's no question, but pastors are warned in their training not to be alone with the woman. There's really no excuse. It's a choice that this man made. He knew he was making a bad choice. It was a troubled wife of one of our church members. And 6 months later, and I saw it because I'm a person that's very sensitive to that sin because I had been given over to it. I saw them flirt. I saw them go deeper into flirting. And then finally, he was caught hiding naked in the closet by her husband. So, I mean, it is a really, it is a thing.
It's definitely a...
It's a process, though. He didn't start out naked in the closet.
Right.
He started out with a single thought. In the process of counseling her, she's vulnerable and I can, whatever.
Right.
And he allowed those thoughts to proceed. So that's why I say there's an awful lot of what is required in personal control in dealing with this whole thing. I hear men say, well, a first look is free. It's not free.
It's not free.
It's not free.
It's not free.
Job said, I have made a covenant with my eye.
Yes.
Why then should I look on his name?
Yep.
And that's the deal.
Yep.
I have covenanted not to submit myself to sexual temptation in any form.
Yes. Yeah. Good points. Okay, lust is not solely a male problem. Just a one anecdote, and then I've got a quote up here. I want to explain the quote before I show it to you, because the quote's kind of embarrassing for me as a teacher to be sharing. Anecdotally, I used to work at a living history museum up in Ohio, and this museum was such, you know, I worked as what's called a museum educator. This is one step up from a volunteer. It was a minimum wage job. I did it after retirement. And we had two types of employees. Old guys like me who were retired, men and women, and young history majors who couldn't find a real job. And so the young history majors were young ladies, young men. One day, we're standing in we had a little village of 1800s houses, and there was a church meeting house, tall meeting house, and we were getting the new roof put on it. And a bunch of us are standing around watching the work because we didn't have a lot of customers at the time. And I'm standing around with several of the young female college students, and we're watching these roofers. And this one guy bebops up the ladder. As soon as he gets up there, he rips off his shirt because it's a hot, sunny day, and exposes his torso, which is a lot more attractive than mine. And the audible verbal response from the ladies that I was standing next to shocked me. I didn't think that was supposed to happen. I felt like I was in a construction site in reverse. Now, The one difference is that their comments were not intended to be heard by him, but they were amongst our group, and I was embarrassed. So I started thinking about this. You know, I have heard forever as a Christian that women aren't visually oriented. Women don't get turned on by what you see. And here I saw something happening. So, by way of introduction to this quote, my computer, it's a Dell, and it runs Windows, and my default internet browser is Microsoft Edge. At least my default Windows browsers used to be Microsoft Edge. And when you go to the Microsoft Edge, its default web page is MSN, where you get a bunch of news feeds and all kinds of silly things. And you get all those clickbait articles and stuff. And a lot of the clickbait, you know, 10 reasons for this, 16 things about this, 15 things about this. Well, at this point, you know, I was just clicking through, and I get to a headline that says, "Breaking Stereotypes, 16 Myths About Women That Simply Aren't True." Well, I thought, I'll bite. The clickbait worked. I clicked, and I'm looking at all these, and most of them, you know, they're all fairly innocuous. Things like, you know, women say, and these are all women saying what you believe about women isn't true, and this one thing, and basically all it was 16 women showing that they're the exceptions to the rule. For example, one of them says, "Don't assume that we're all great multitaskers. You know, we have to do it, but we're not good at it." You know, things like that. Or don't assume that we all like to cook. You know, that type of thing. Well, one of the ladies said this, that women aren't turned on by visual stimulus, i.e. a hot body, is a prominent myth in conservative Christian circles. It implies they aren't tempted by men who dress immodestly, whereas men can't help but stumble if a woman is visually appealing. Now, this is written by a woman. I have no idea who it was. I don't know if she has any credentials. I'm sure she is just expressing her own experience. But that got me to thinking, so more research. And going to what Allison was saying, this here I'm going to be relying on my red shirt again. Studies have been done to test this. There are physiological changes that take place in the human body when you are getting aroused. Okay? And they can be measured through instruments. So studies have been done where the surveyors, researchers, hook people up to instruments to measure what's happening inside their bodies, and then they show them erotic imagery. Been more than one study along these lines, and the results are fairly consistent. The results show that both men and women exhibit physiological signs of arousal by viewing erotic imagery. The difference is if you ask the man, "Does this arouse you?" he's going to say yes. If you ask the women, "Does this arouse you?" they routinely say no. But their bodies are saying yes. And the researchers don't know why this is. Is the message not getting from the body to the brain? Is the message getting there, but women have been conditioned so much that the right answer is no, so you deny it even though you're feeling it? It's an interesting dilemma, and I've come to view things differently. If you look at it in the pornography industry will tell you about 30% of pornography consumers are women, and that number is growing. But there's good news. There's good news. Let me get to my last point. Lust can be forgivable, should be forgivable. There's a guy out there who has written a book entitled Addicted to Lust. His name is Samuel Perry. And this is a book that's focusing on pornography in the lives of conservative Protestants. And he's focusing primarily on committed conservative Christians. Because if you look at studies, I know Barna has a major study about 7 years ago now, I think it was 2016, in which the results of that study were very depressing. In that basically, I'm not going to throw out numbers because the numbers can be deceiving, but a very large proportion of self-identifying Christian men and Christian women admit to viewing pornography at least once a month. And it's spooky. The numbers for pastors and youth pastors are also spooky. But Samuel Perry decided to look into it deeper because it was just simply self-identifying Christians. So a person can identify as a Christian who has absolutely no interest whatsoever in Jesus Christ. So he wanted to go into it, dig into it deeper. And he wanted to look at, okay, I'm going to look at people who are really committed to their faith. And again, you're still relying upon self-identification, but you're going to trim down the numbers. And when he focused on the number of people, when he focused on people who were committed Christians, people who have a daily walk with Christ, people who are faithful church attenders, people who read their Bibles regularly, people who pray regularly, things of that nature, the numbers of pornography use came way down. And so that's the good news. People who are really, and they're not growing, okay? Those numbers aren't growing, at least what he saw. So the good news is that it's not as bad as we think it is. And I have not read this book. I've not read Samuel Perry's book. Instead, I read a review of the book written in an article online entitled, "Conservative Christians Have a Porn Problems, but Not the One You Think." And the bad news is, despite the fact that things aren't as bad in the committed Christian world, those committed Christians who use pornography suffer much more shame and guilt, and you're much more likely to suffer through a divorce than if you're an unbeliever being caught in using pornography. And the point that Perry's trying to make, and the article that I read is trying to make, is that we Christians, when it comes to pornography use, lust, all of these areas of sin, we suddenly become very unforgiving, very condemning, very judgmental. And as I said before, this has come as close to an unpardonable sin as we have adopted. I'm not going to get involved in anybody's individual life. I'm not going to judge anybody who's had the pain of going through a divorce. Life in a fallen world is way too messy to make simple platitudes about who should or should not be getting a divorce under what circumstances. And I'm certainly not going there. But I will say that as a Christian, it does bother me a little bit that somehow our unbelieving married friends are able to work through a porn issue much better than we are. And that seems to bother me. It bothers me about that. It bothers me that Perry makes the point that even though pornography use is much less amongst committed Christians, when it does rise, a committed Christian is much more likely to say, "I'm addicted," than an unbelieving person. Now that can be a good thing if in fact you are addicted. But he's saying that there are people who admit to being addicted when they're not addicted. It's just, we've made a very, 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 very big issue out of it, and it is a big issue. I don't want to minimize it. But we've made it an issue of judgment, condemnation, shame and embarrassment, he says that there are many Christians who, once they recognize that they are seeing things that they shouldn't see, rather than dealing with the shame and guilt, they just simply stop going to church. They just drop out of Christian fellowship. That's not a good thing. I don't know how we walk this tightrope of hating sin and loving sinners. I mean, that is such a tightrope. I don't know how we walk that and how we convey to one another, even if it's within our own marriage. I don't know how we convey to one another that, yeah, this is an issue, but I'm not going to leave you over this issue. Our marriage is more important than that. We are still one. And again, I don't mean to sound like, I don't take, if you're in this situation and you've made other decisions, don't think that I'm trying to condemn you for that. I'm not suggesting that at all. You know, like I said, life is too messy to make simple platitudes. But I do think that we need, as Christians, conservative Christians, we need to find a way of showing compassion. You know, I read years and years and years ago, don't even know where now, but you know, the human sex drive is the second strongest natural instinctive drive that we have, next to the drive for survival. If that is the case, then there's going to be, you have to expect that there's going to be misuse of that drive, just as there's misuse of the drive for survival. We abuse people because of that. There's going to be abuse of this natural drive, and again, never to diminish the importance of a sin, we need to be understanding and cut people a little bit of slack for being human beings. You know, whether the sex drive came as a result of the fall or as a result of God's creation, it's you know, that's not the issue. The issue is it's strong. I will say this, you know, Buck, you pointed out that you believe it's part of God's creation. That's the Jewish approach. And let me just finish with this little interesting tidbit. When it comes to marriage and sexuality, the Jews could not be any more different than the established Christian church over the years. In the Jewish world, they took very seriously the command to be fruitful and multiply. In the Jewish world, everybody is expected to be married. There is no hint of a thought that being single is a more spiritual state than being married. Everybody is expected to be married as soon as possible, preferably before you reach the age of 20. And they even say that rabbis are encouraged to strongly pressure people over the age of 20 to get married in the Jewish world. They believe very strongly that sexual pleasure and desire were part of God's original creation, hence the Song of Solomon. It's, you know, it's amazing as I researched this, the total dichotomy between how the Jews, especially in the Old Testament, believed about marriage and sex, and how Christians developed over the centuries. I don't know what we do living as part of a Christian culture that as a established institution, at least in my view, seem to go so far astray from God's original good creation in this area. I think we've got a lot of reformation to do in that area, and hopefully we'll get there someday. Okay, it is 10:33. I finished. No part 2, and so let me close this in prayer. Father, we do thank you. Thank you for this time. I thank you for the discussion. I thank you for the gracious thoughts and the understanding hearts and ears. And I pray now that you will just guide us. Buck is absolutely right. This is a God-given normal function of life. It is a beautiful function of life, but it can be so easily abused. And I pray that you will give us a strength to avoid that abuse. Give us the love that we need for our spouses, to love them in such a way that this doesn't become an issue. I pray that you'll give us grace in knowing how to deal with the ugliness of sin, while at the same time loving the sinners. Father, I pray that you will go with us now. Be with us in the service. We thank you for the worship team. I pray that you will be with them as they guide us into your throne. I pray that you'll be with Pastor as he gives us your message on the unity of the body. We pray this all now in Jesus' name.